But about one name for this age no one can argue. This is the nuclear age. The age of the always present threat of instant and total annihilation. How did we get here? How did it all begin? It was born in another time, in a world like this. 1945, a global war fought by great navies and armies, great numbers of men and weapons, as wars had always been fought. Until 8:15 on the morning of August 6, 1945, when a single plane carrying a single bomb opened the age we now live in. The decision to drop an atomic bomb on the city of Hiroshima was perhaps the most important decision of our time. The controversy it stirred has gone on with rising intensity ever since. How was the decision made? Why was it made? Could the instant destruction of Hiroshima of 70,000 Japanese men, women, and children have been avoided? In the spring of 1945, it was known that an atomic bomb would be made. All that remained was to decide whether and how to use it. This is the story of the 135 days of that decision. The first day, April 12, 1945.
We interrupt this program with a special bulletin. Our press association has announced that President Roosevelt is dead. The president died of a cerebral hemorrhage. All we know is that the president died in Warm Springs, Georgia.
He has been president for 12 years, longer than any other man. He is the only president many have known. Now, on this April afternoon, with the United States at war around the world, he is suddenly gone. Now someone else must make the life and death decisions. The vice president is almost unknown. He has been in office less than 3 months, obscured by the dominating figure of the president. Now he is president, the leader by chance of the greatest military coalition in history. At 7:09 p.m., Harry S. Truman takes the oath of office he never wanted to hold, assumes the responsibilities for which he has had no time to be prepared or briefed. He says, the moon, the stars, and all the planets just fell on me. He says, pray for me. He tells his cabinet, no one can fill the void that has been left. He says he will try to carry on Roosevelt's policies. When the cabinet leaves, one man stays behind. 78-year-old Secretary of War Henry L. Stimson, weary but iron-willed, with a secret he must now tell the new president. A moment is described by his friend and biographer, McGeorge Bundy.
Mr. Truman tells of that conversation in this language. Stimson told me he wanted me to know about an important project that was underway. A project looking to the development of a new explosive of almost unbelievable destructive power. That was all he felt free to say, and his statement left me puzzled. It was the first information that had come to me about the atomic bomb, but he gave me no details.
The Pentagon. The project to build the atomic bomb has been given the code name Manhattan District. It is being built under the direction of a recently promoted Brigadier General of the Corps of Engineers. His name is Leslie Groves. He reports only to Army Chief of Staff George Marshall, Secretary of War Stimson, and the President. A few doors away, the future strategy of the war is being planned. Few of the planners have been told the secret of the bomb. Secretary of State Stettinius and the men in the State Department planning the post-war policy of the United States do not know the secret. On Capitol Hill, congressmen who have appropriated $2 billion for the Manhattan District do not know on what the money is being spent. In laboratories around the country, there are men who know the secret. The scientists are deeply worried by the implications of the force they are about to let loose on the world. One is Leo Szilard, who urged Einstein to tell Roosevelt that the United States ought to try to make an atomic bomb. He recorded his views about the bomb before he died. They are read by his wife.
And this is what he said. In the spring of '45, it was clear that the war against Germany would soon end. And so I began to ask myself, what is the purpose of continuing the development of the bomb? And how would the bomb be used if the war with Japan has not ended by the time we had the first bomb? Initially, we were strongly motivated to produce the bomb because we feared the Germans would get ahead of us. And the only way to prevent them from dropping bombs on us was to have bombs in readiness ourselves. But now with the war won, it was not clear what we were working for. And because of secrecy, there was no intermediate level in the government to which we could have gone for a careful consideration of these issues. The only man with whom we were sure we were entitled to communicate was the president.
I knew any number of people who could have reached Roosevelt. But I know nobody offhand who could have reached Truman. Truman just did not move in the same circles.
As Harry Truman comes to speak for the first time to a joint session of Congress, he has much on his mind that takes priority over the atomic bomb. He is still forming his administration. He is still learning his job. Pressing problems around the world demand his attention. Foremost among these is the global war the United States is fighting.
I call upon all Americans to help me keep our nation united in defense of those ideals which have been so eloquently proclaimed by Franklin Roosevelt. Our demand has been, and it remains, unconditional surrender.
For the next 11 days, the president has no time to think about a secret weapon that may or may not work. As he speaks, 3 million American GIs are in Europe, fighting their way across Germany. And beyond the strategy of the war lies the problem of what to do with Germany after the war. How to restore Europe. How to deal with the Soviet Union. On the other side of the world, in the Pacific, on the islands and coral atolls, the Japanese are resisting fanatically. The toll of United States dead and wounded on the beaches and in the jungles is rising. At this moment, far from the war, hidden in the hills of East Tennessee, at a place not even on a map, called Oak Ridge, under rigid security restrictions, is a plant that uses twice as much electricity as the city of Memphis, uses huge amounts of raw material, has cost almost $1 billion, but does not seem to produce anything. The fact is, behind the wall of security, slowly, painfully, Oak Ridge is manufacturing uranium-235, the explosive material for the atomic bomb. April 25, 1945. As the conference to organize the United Nations begins, State Department policy planners still have not been told about the bomb. The President still has not been briefed. Worried by this, Secretary of War Stimson arranges to see the President.
Mr. Stimson took with him to that meeting a memorandum which he kept among his records and which tells very clearly the way in which he then saw the matter. He pointed out that while the United States was ahead in developing the weapon, it would not remain ahead indefinitely, certainly would not preserve a monopoly forever, and that the nation which would catch up first would be the Soviet Union. Pointed out that the weapon and its use were not merely an immediate military question, but a political question, since this new force threatened the very existence of civilization.
With Secretary Stimson is General Groves.
Mr. Truman did not like to read long reports, and this report was not long, considering the size of the project. It's about 24 pages. And he would constantly interrupt his reading to say, well, I don't like to read papers.
And Mr. Stimson would reply, well, we can't tell you this in any more concise language. This is a big project. The President indicated his feeling that it was sound and that there was no reason to make any changes in our course of action.
As May begins, the Red Army is advancing street by street through the burning ruins of Berlin. The Nazis announce Hitler is dead. The war in Europe is ending. But even as the last bitter battle is being fought, the problems of post-war Europe, the war in the Pacific, now begin to occupy the minds of the political leaders. Stimson again meets in secret with the President. His then assistant, John McCloy, describes his state of mind.
Of course, he was greatly involved in the mechanical production of the bomb, the physical problems that were connected with that. But I think more deeply than that, he was also involved with the heavy responsibilities and the heavy imponderables that were related to the bomb and its use.
The Secretary recommended the establishment of a special committee called the Interim Committee to consider all aspects of the matter, and in particular the immediate and pressing question of the relation of this new weapon to the war against Japan.
The membership had been worked on until we got what we thought would be a very fine committee. We even went so far as to say that, of course, the President should be allowed to, if he wanted to pick a man for it. And of course, he could upset it and pick all of his own people. But he even picked the man that we wanted on there, who was Mr. Burns.
James F. Burns, former Supreme Court Justice, former rival to Harry Truman for the vice presidency, soon to become his Secretary of State and his most influential advisor. As Stimson sees the President at the Pentagon, General Groves meets with General Marshall.
I thought it was time to start the planning for the actual military operation. I said that I thought that I would like to have him designate 2 officers in the Operations Division of the General Staff that I could talk to and get them started on making their plans. Very much to my surprise, General Marshall said, after a moment's thought, he said, "Is there any reason why you can't do that yourself?" My reply was, "No, sir," and those were the instructions I had, and the only instructions I had about formulating the war plans. I then talked to General Arnold, the Chief of Air Force, about it, told him that I wanted some advice from some of his officers. General Norstadt, who was then the Chief of Staff of the 20th Air Force, which was a big bombing command under the direct control of General Arnold, was assigned to assist me in that way. I appointed a target committee to survey the field so that we would have the right targets in Japan and so that everything would be ready at the time that we needed to be ready.
May 8. In Europe, after 4.5 years of war, 20 million dead, Germany surrenders unconditionally. Will the same bloody battles have to be repeated across the Japanese home islands? This is the question United States military planners must now answer. As they ponder this, B-29s take off from a remote airfield in the Utah desert. On board are pit crews, part of a secret air unit designated the 509th Composite Group. They have not been told what their mission is. Day after day, they practice, learning to drop a bomb that has not yet been invented. May 9, 1945. The war in Europe is over. The nations of Europe lie in ruins. Thousands are hungry, without clothes, homeless. The United States and the Soviet Union begin to quarrel over the future of Germany and Eastern Europe. Winston Churchill urges a Big Three meeting before United States troops are sent to the Pacific. Washington, in answer to Churchill. The President tentatively agrees to a July 1st meeting. Secretary Stimson urges delay.
His diary puts it this way. The President has promised to meet Stalin and Churchill the 1st of July, and at that time these questions will become burning. It may be necessary to have it out with Russia on her relations to Manchuria, Port Arthur, and other ports of North China. Over any such tangled weave of problems, this secret would be dominant. And yet there was a problem, as the diary entry goes on to say, in the fact that we would not know by the 1st of July, in all probability, whether or not the weapon was, in fact, a success. And the Secretary noted that it seemed a terrible thing to gamble with such big stakes in diplomacy without having your master plan in your hand.
May 9, the first meeting of the Interim Committee. Stimson is chairman, George Harrison his deputy, Gordon Arneson recording secretary.
Some of the members had not heard of this project, the Manhattan District. They knew nothing about the development of the atomic bomb. So much of the meeting was devoted to a technical briefing, which was conducted by Mr. Harrison and by General Groves. Another question that came up at this meeting was, how long would it take the Soviet Union to produce an atomic weapon? Estimates ranged from 3 to 4 years, as suggested by Dr. Bush and Dr. Conant, to 20 years, as suggested by General Groves. Mr. Burns felt that this point was a very important one. It would have a very important bearing on how we dealt with the Soviet Union on this question. Whether to try to bring them in at an early stage, whether to outrace them, just what our posture ought to be.
Later, in another conference room, General Groves meets with his target committee to discuss their assignment.
Of course, the target committee was given definite instructions by me as to what we wanted. We wanted, for example, the first city to be bombed. We wanted it to be big enough so that the effects of the bomb would run out, that it wouldn't be a small spot out on a desert that you wouldn't know what the effect would be.
May 25, the Joint Chiefs meet to talk about plans for the war against Japan. The next step to be taken after the Okinawa campaign. The Navy advocates blockading Japan, invading the China coast. The Air Force wants to force Japan to surrender with its fire raids. General Marshall favors invasion of the Japanese home islands. Admiral Nimitz and General MacArthur concur. Chief of Staff Admiral Lay agrees, but he says the invasion could cost up to 1 million American lives. The decision of the Joint Chiefs is to recommend to the President Operation Olympic against Kyushu in November, Coronet against Honshu in the spring. The Joint Chiefs do not consider the atomic bomb. They do not know if it will work or how effective it will be. Meanwhile, Japan is being destroyed by conventional weapons. A record 400 B-29s attacked Japan with firebombs. The Japanese are being burned in their cities from one end of the homeland to the other. Behind the walls of the Imperial Palace, the leaders are divided on how to face the looming disaster. Marquis Kido, Lord Privy Seal, advisor to the Emperor.
At least one city, and at times two, was being turned into ashes daily. I don't know how many cities there are in Japan, but I realized that they would all be leveled in time. With the winter approaching, tens of millions of people would die a dog's death from hunger and exposure. And I said to them, how can we carry on the war under such condition?
Colonel Hayashi, Secretary to War Minister Anami.
It was our hope that we would be able to deal a heavy blow to the American landing forces, and this victory would induce the Americans to propose the termination of the war to us. We had no delusion that this blow could finish off the American strength, but we clung to the hope that this would give us a bargaining advantage to ask for better terms in the peace treaty.
Cabinet Secretary Sakamizu.
Therefore, if anyone ever dared to utter a word about ceasefire or anything like that, he would be arrested by the military police. If he were a government official, he would have been dismissed from his post. So no one could speak out or say anything of that sort openly.
Washington. The president delays the Big Three meeting. This is Stimson's idea. He wants to have the bomb ready before the president meets Stalin. Later, back at the Pentagon, Stimson sends for General Groves.
He asked me, had I selected the targets yet? I replied, yes, the targets, I had that report all ready, and I expected to take it over to General Marshall the following morning for his consideration and approval. Mr. Stimson then said, well, your report's all finished, isn't it? And I said, well, I haven't gone over it yet, Mr. Stimson. I want to be sure that I've got it just right. And he said, well, I'd like to see it. And I said, well, it's across the river and it would take a long time to get it. He said, I have all day, and I know how fast your office operates. There's a phone on this desk. You pick it up and you call your office and have them bring that report over. And when I protested slightly that I thought that was something that General Marshall should pass on first, Mr. Stimson said, this is one time that I'm going to be the final deciding authority. Nobody's going to tell me what to do on this. He said, on this matter, I am the kingpin, and you might just as well get that report over here. Well, in the meantime, he asked me what cities I was planning on bombing, or what targets. I informed him and told him that Kyoto was the preferred target as the first one because it was of such size that we would have no question about the effects of the bomb. He immediately said, well, I don't want Kyoto bombed. And he went on to tell me about its long history as the cultural center of Japan, a former ancient capital, and a great many reasons why he didn't want to see it bombed. When the report came over and I handed it to him, and he really, his mind was made up as soon as he heard the word Kyoto. There's no question about that. After he got the report, he read it over. Then he walked over to the door separating his office from General Marshall's, opened it, and said, General Marshall, if you're not busy, I wish you'd come in. And then the secretary really double-crossed me, because without any explanation, he said to General Marshall, Marshall, General Groves has just brought me his report on the proposed targets. He says, I don't like it.
Kyoto is removed from the target list. The second target on the list is Hiroshima. May 31. The headlines report the fire raids on Japan have left 1 million homeless. The Japanese dead now number in 6 figures. Air Force General LeMay says we are driving the Japanese back to the caves. In this atmosphere, the interim committee meets to recommend to the president how to use the atomic bomb. Presiding, Henry Stimson. Recording Secretary, Gordon Arneson.
The question arose, what should our posture be with regard to the Soviet Union? Dr. Oppenheimer thought that we should mention these developments in general terms to the Soviet Union, and hope for subsequent discussions that might lead to cooperation in the field.
Head of the scientific panel, Robert Oppenheimer.
Mr. Stimson was clearly thinking along these lines. And although General Marshall and General Groves, who were not members of the committee, were in one or another sense military men, and although they may have had somewhat different sense of urgency and priority, they did not, at that meeting, approach these questions in a way very different than that put forward by the panel.
In this connection, General Marshall did say, as a kind of passing thought, I don't put it any higher than that, that perhaps it would be a good idea to invite the Soviet Union to send observers to the test at Alamogordo. This suggestion was not taken up by anyone else and was quickly passed by. Mr. Burns felt very strongly at this stage that we should not share any information with the Soviet Union, nor should we make any immediate overtures to them.
James Burns, representing the President on the interim committee.
I cannot speak for the others, but it was ever present in my mind that it was important that we should have an end to the war before the Russians came in.
The meeting continues behind closed doors. Other points are raised. Former Harvard President Conant.
We were operating in a climate of opinion in which everybody almost took for granted a tremendous destruction of civilian lives and of civilian dwelling houses and of cities.
And I believe that the horror of the war that was on and the horror of the war which military planners expected to continue for a long time was so very great that it was more or less taken for granted that if a new weapon could put an end to this agony, it should be so used.
Any weapon that would bring an end to the war and save the lives, save 1 million casualties among American boys was justified.
At lunchtime, Mr. Burns asked Dr. Lawrence to raise again the question that had been raised earlier simply in passing, namely that the weapon should not be used against the Japanese in the war, but that there should be a striking but harmless demonstration of this weapon in the hope that the Japanese might be persuaded to sue for peace. Coupled with this demonstration, of course, was the possibility that the weapon might have to be used subsequently if the Japanese were not sufficiently impressed. This idea was discussed at some length. Dr. Oppenheimer, for example, said he doubted whether there could be devised any sufficiently startling demonstration that would convince the Japanese they ought to throw in the sponge.
Remember, none of us had then ever seen a bomb go off. We had no idea as to what you could do, or what sort of effect it would have.
If we were to try a demonstration over Japanese territory, the plane might be shot down, American prisoners of war might be brought into the demonstration area.
The President would have had to take the responsibility of telling the world that we had this atomic bomb and how terrific it was. That would be the specific declaration. And if it didn't prove that, what would have happened to the war, the good Lord only knows.
Someone finally said, unless this weapon is used with maximum impact, it may be very difficult for anyone to see much difference between it and the firebomb raids that were going on at that very time over Tokyo.
June 1, the headlines say P-29 fire raids burn 82 square miles of Japan. The divided Japanese leaders continue to argue about what to do, how to halt the slaughter. As this goes on, in Washington, the interim committee makes a unanimous recommendation to the president. Use the atomic bomb against Japan without warning.
You have to say, from our point of view, what would have been the consequences if we had advised against the use of this weapon because it was so new and was so concentrated in its effect. And if our advice had been followed by the president who made the final decision, what would this mean? And from our point of view, it would have meant continuing the devastation of Japan by conventional methods. It would have meant, so we were led to believe, the invasion of Japan and a continuation for months of a terrible war, causing not only American casualties but enormous loss of life in the Japanese as well. This would have been the consequences. I don't see under those conditions how a person could fail to make the decision to use a weapon which we believed would shorten the war.
The recommendation of the interim committee was a recommendation only. The final responsibility for making a recommendation to the president himself rested with Mr. Stimson. He never sought to conceal that.
As the committee adjourns, one member of the scientific panel has a question. Arthur Compton, head of the Chicago project, says, "What shall I tell Szilard and the other scientists?"
He was told that he could mention the committee that it was anxious to have the views of the scientists. He asked several groups to prepare papers. This took place on the 2nd of June. Among the groups asked to write papers was one which became known as the Frank Committee.
The Frank Committee has its report ready to go to Washington within a few days. One of the signers is Glenn Seaborg, who 18 years later will become chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission.
Some of the main conclusions of that report were that there were no long-lasting secrets of nuclear energy, of nuclear weapons, that other nations would obtain nuclear weapons in the not-too-distant future after the war, and therefore international control of some kind was imperative. But perhaps the conclusion that has been most publicized was the suggestion that the nuclear weapon not be dropped directly upon Japan, but that it be demonstrated first on some uninhabited area.
The report was supposed to be taken by Compton, who went on a business trip to Washington. And Frank was so anxious to see that it was really delivered to the as high a person as possible, Stimson, that he volunteered to accompany Compton on this trip. If I remember correctly, there was only an upper berth available. Frank climbed an upper berth just to bring the report personally to Washington.
They came to the Pentagon on June 12, hoping to see the secretary. He was not available, nor was the vice chairman, George Harrison. I received them, talked with them about the report, received copies of the report as well as a covering letter which Dr. Compton had written. He said he thought that these recommendations did not take fully enough into consideration the fact that a technical demonstration might mean considerable prolongation of the war. And second, failure to use the weapon in all its fury might make it very difficult for the world to understand what it really was facing. And not understanding what it was facing, might not make the effort that really was needed to see whether we could not get effective international control. Well, I got the report and the Compton letter to Harrison as quickly as he was available. Harrison said, well, this report really ought to be examined and commented upon by the scientific panel before the interim committee is asked to express its views. So he called Dr. Compton in Los Alamos and said he wanted to know what the scientific panel thought about this proposal, and that the interim committee intended to hold off discussion of the report until they had the views of the scientific panel in hand.
June 18, the main public event in Washington is a hero's welcome for General Dwight Eisenhower. While crowds cheer the supreme commander of the European war, the nation's leaders once again consider the problems of the unfinished war in the Pacific. As Eisenhower rides down Pennsylvania Avenue at the White House, a decision is being made. Secretary Stimson and the Joint Chiefs meet with the President. They tell him there is no alternative to invading Japan. They estimate the war will end in the fall, 1946. The atomic bomb is mentioned, but it has not yet been tested. No one knows what it will do. A delay in the invasion plans is not considered. The President agrees. He has no alternative. He orders the Joint Chiefs to go ahead. Machinery for the first stage of the invasion begins to move. The invasion will be here. Kyushu, D-Day, November 1. In Japan, on a similar map, the same problem is being examined by Lieutenant General Arasue.
Those of us in the second department, the G2, had to consider whether the American forces would try to land in the southern Kyushu or on the Kanto plains. Our conclusion was that if the Americans landed on southern Kyushu, our present forces alone would be sufficient to fight off the Americans.
Tsunezo Wachi, commander of suicide naval forces in Kyushu.
I deployed my forces along numerous points along the coast. There were about 600 Shinyo-type craft under my command, and they were posted throughout the coastline, hidden in small ports and other vantage points for defense. In Koshikijima Island, there were about 100 Kaiten-type human torpedoes primed for action. We were absolutely confident that with these forces, we could meet and sink at least 200 American transports.
June 21, the Interim Committee hears the scientific panel's answer to questions raised by the Frank report.
I remember that we first responded to the question, what do scientists think, by saying that they think a variety of things, and this is only natural. This is not a completely trivial question. We said second that we didn't think that we had before us the kind of information or the kind of insight, or in back of us the kind of experience that really qualified us to cope with this decision. We said that there seemed to be two great views among scientists, and no doubt would be among others if people knew about it. On the one hand, they hoped that this instrument would never be used in war, and therefore they hoped that we would not start out by using it. On the other hand, they hoped, or other people hoped, that it would put an end to this war, save countless lives, put an end to a butchery that had been going on for many years and had been marked by atrocities, concentration camps, murderous raids on cities, Rotterdam and Dresden and Tokyo itself. And that on the whole we were inclined to think that if it was needed to put an end to the war and had a chance of so doing, we thought that was the right thing to do. It is not that we said a test isn't feasible. We said we don't think we could recommend one that was likely to induce surrender.
On hearing this report from the panel, the interim committee decided that they would reaffirm their earlier decision that the weapon should be used against the Japanese at the earliest opportunity, that it would be used without warning, and that it should be used against a war industries complex surrounded by homes or other buildings most susceptible to damage.
As the interim committee confirms its recommendation to use the atomic bomb on Japan, the battle for Okinawa ends. In 3 months, 98,000 Japanese have died. There have been 80,000 American casualties. On the atoll of Tinian, 1,000 plain B-29 fire raids are being prepared against Japan. Standing by is the mysterious 509th Composite Group. It has no bombs, goes on no raids. Its crews do not know the time for its mission is now only 6 weeks away. But now in Washington, some are reconsidering that mission. One is Undersecretary of the Navy and interim committee member Ralph Bard.
Various people in the armed forces, and scientists, and various people who are close to the picture began to have second thoughts about the advisability of dropping this bomb without some kind of a warning to the Japanese.
I felt rather strongly that we should have a specific warning. We should tell them just what it was, that this word atom bomb connoted so many things, that this would be of deep significance.
It seemed to me not only that it was a sin, to use a good word, should be more often used, to kill non-combatants, but that if such a weapon could be made, it would be better that it not be used in a war which was ending, in order that we might reserve to ourselves the knowledge of its construction and its use in the event that someday we might need it to preserve our government and our safety.
It was definitely seemed to me that the Japanese were ready for surrender. They were becoming weaker and weaker. They were surrounded by the Navy. They couldn't get any imports in, and they couldn't export anything. And naturally, as time went on and the war developed in our favor, quite logical to hope and expect that with the proper kind of a warning that the Japanese would have made peace.
Bard was troubled by the decision, and he still hoped that it might be possible to work out some sort of technical demonstration, that it was worth a try, that it might just work. And he hoped that might be the decision. Harrison received this memorandum and duly passed it on to the Secretary of War. I think primarily to let the Secretary know that the view was no longer unanimous.
In Los Alamos, New Mexico, Among the scientists who will assemble the bomb, it is not unanimous either. Dr. Edward Teller.
I got a letter from Chicago, from my good friend Leo Szilard. He wrote to me about the Frank Committee, about the suggestion not to use the nuclear bomb on Japan without a previous test. Szilard very often caused me to think about things seriously. I did not always agree with him, but on this occasion I felt that he was right.
A number of people began arguing that we should not use the bomb militarily because Germany was obviously collapsing and the Japanese were suffering many reverses. And so there was a great deal of discussion within the laboratory about unwisdom of using the bombs militarily, and some people suggested we drop a bomb somewhere not far from Tokyo in the Tokyo Bay, and some others suggested we drop them over Mount Fujiyama just to scare the Japanese.
You ask yourself, would the Japanese government as then constituted, and with the bitter division between the peace party and the war party, would it have been influenced by an enormous nuclear firecracker detonated at great height, doing little damage? And your answer is as good as mine. I don't know.
Dr. Teller says Dr. Oppenheimer spoke to him about his protest.
He told me not to do anything. He told me that Szilard was using the influence of a scientist in an improper way. That neither Szilard nor I nor the majority of the people at Los Alamos did have proper and sufficient information to make a decision or to influence a decision, because we certainly could not have made it, to influence a decision in such a weighty manner.
And the story was that he had seen military intelligence estimates on the course of war in Japan, prepared, of course, without knowledge of the atomic bomb, and that these estimates were that the Japanese were quite unready to surrender, that they would continue waging the war even though realizing its eventual outcome, until well after we invaded the main islands of Japan in November, and that probably 1 million casualties would result.
I know only that I was told that an invasion was planned, that it would be necessary, and that it would be terribly costly.
And it is this information which Oppenheimer told us, and it certainly had some effect on me, and I began to think that maybe under these conditions, such an enormously drastic step as a military use of the bomb would be justified to reduce the total number of casualties and end the war much sooner.
July 8, on board the cruiser Augusta, en route to the Big Three meeting. The President now knows the bomb test is scheduled for July 15. Now the waiting begins. Japan is in ashes. The situation is growing more desperate every day. But the Army and the Foreign Office still quarrel over what to do. The Army agrees to seek peace, but only if the Soviet Union is mediator.
Foreign Minister Togo was opposed to having the Soviet Union act as a mediator. But the Army was adamant in asking the Soviet Union to mediate. Mr. Togo's view was that it would be totally ineffective to rely on the Soviet Union as a mediator. However, the Army rebutted this argument by saying that if the Soviet Union were to become the mediator, That would automatically prevent her from entering the war and suddenly invading Manchuria.
In Moscow, Ambassador Sato is instructed to see Stalin. But Stalin has promised to enter the war against Japan in return for concessions in Manchuria. He does not see Sato. He leaves for the Big Three meeting in Potsdam. On the Augusta, the Japanese effort to get Stalin to intercede is known. The Japanese diplomatic code has been broken. The president knows of the division among the Japanese leaders. Alamogordo, New Mexico. At the bomb test site, the scientists are working under growing pressure. They are told there must be no further delays. The president must know the results of the test when he meets with Stalin. Meanwhile, in Chicago, Leo Szilard tries once again to influence the decision.
Dr. Szilard at Chicago circulated a petition on which he had some 60-odd signatures, which again hoped that the weapon would not be used militarily against the Japanese, that there would be a demonstration, that maybe the weapon would have to be used if the demonstration didn't work. But in any event, the decision should be taken in full awareness of the moral responsibilities that were involved. This petition generated counter-petitions.
It was difficult to judge by these petitions just what the scientists did think. As a result, General Groves asked Arthur Compton to conduct an opinion poll of the Chicago scientists to determine just what was the range of thinking and who favored what. This opinion poll covered the whole range from no use to military use, most effective to achieve an early surrender with a minimum loss of American lives.
The scientists at Chicago are polled individually. There is no discussion. Afterwards, no one can agree on what they have said.
There's been some controversy about that poll, whether the questions were quite clear or not, but Dr. Compton felt that 46% of those polled, of I think about 150, felt that the weapon should be used militarily.
Szilard and the others disagree. But by the time the poll reaches the Pentagon, it is too late. How it is interpreted no longer makes any difference.
The Compton poll arrived in Washington on the 1st of August. And I think it would be only frank to say that at that time, as far as my impression was, that as far as Secretary Stimson was concerned, the issue had been decided and there was no further need for expressions of opinion from the scientists in Chicago or anywhere else.
In mid-July, a car arrives at the test site. In the back seat is the plutonium for the bomb. The man who receives it is General Groves' deputy, General Farrell.
On Friday the 13th, the active material which went into the bomb was ready. I signed a receipt for it in order to get off the accountability of the scientists who had it. When I did so, I took it in my hands. As I felt the glowing warmth of this material. For the first time, I began to sense that maybe there was something to this business, and it wasn't just a lot of hooey, that there was some possibility of a latent energy in this material.
It is 48 hours before H hour at ground zero. Sunday, July 15, 1945, Alamogordo, New Mexico. It is D-1 for the test of the world's first atomic device. The plutonium arrives at the tower on which the device has been placed. It'll be hoisted to the top where General Farrell and others wait.
There was a delay in the insertion of the ball of active material into a cylindrical hole in the bomb. It just stuck and wouldn't go in. Dr. Brocker, who's in charge of the assembly, said, "Oh, leave it alone. It'll get warm and go in." As a matter of fact, this warmth generated in the active material heated the tube. It expanded enough so it went in, slipped in, but tight fit. And then the bomb was covered by a canvas tarpaulin, and everybody came back to camp to let it rest for a while.
But when General Groves heard about it, he hit the roof and announced that this was too dangerous. There could be sabotage or something, and that somebody had to watch the bomb until very shortly before the explosion. And so 3 people were selected to do it. Bainbridge, who was in charge of the test site, myself, because I had a major role in the bomb assembly, and Captain McKibben, in charge of the military police guarding the site. And so we drove to the tower holding the bomb, and I climbed halfway up on a platform and sat there with big searchlight watching for Groves' saboteurs that fortunately never came. And Bainbridge was down on the ground with a telephone in his hands, ready to alert other people if somebody were approaching the tower. And finally, Captain McKibben stood there with a machine gun to defend us if necessary.
In the bunkers, the scientists and the generals wait. No one is quite sure that the $2 billion device they call the gadget will work.
There were 100 things that could be done wrong, any one of which, as far as we knew, and we knew pretty much, could make the test a failure, not because there was anything in principle wrong, but because we had muffed one of the many complicated pieces of machinery which we were using.
The weather was not good. We wanted a definite wind direction so that if we had a cloud of radioactive material as we expected, that it would not pass over any city of any size. And this meant that it had to be sort of guided of course it went in a straight line. So you had to figure out just where that wind was. Our worst problem was Amarillo, and we did not want any cloud to get over Amarillo and then have a rainstorm bring the radioactive material down.
The weather is checked. Preparations continue. The scientists make up a pool on the power of the device. Fermi suggests it may blow up New Mexico. As the waiting goes on, the tension increases.
It was a situation where I did not want Dr. Oppenheimer to get nervous. We, at a reasonable hour, something like 9:30, I told him that he should go to bed and be called at 12. I said, he said, "Well, you can't sleep, can you?" I said, "Why, yes, I'm going over here, and Dr. Bush and Conant going with me, and we'll go to sleep in a tent over here."
I hadn't slept for quite a while, and I saw a tent with a cot in it, so I rolled in to get a little bit of sleep if possible. And the wind blew the tent over, and the rain soaked me somewhat. But everyone else around was pretty well soaked, too, so it didn't make much difference.
I remember the floor was covered with mud puddles, and a couple of people were lying down, sound asleep, on the floor in the water and the mud. Someone else had curled up on one of the bench tops between the oscillographs and was trying to catch a cat nap. And in general, there was none of the electric excitement you might have expected at this time. It was just an air of total weariness while people waited.
Certain observations couldn't be made, and there was even some danger of fallout going to the wrong places. But finally, because of the enormous political pressure to make the test, while the Potsdam Conference of President Truman and Churchill and Stalin was still in progress, Oppenheimer decided to make the test early in the morning.
At 4:45 a.m., Jack Hubbard gave me his weather report showing wind directions and velocities at all levels up to about 30,000 feet. This looks good as far as the safety of the people in the observation post and in the main camp. There were a few clouds, but this was going to improve with time. So that at 4:45 decided to go ahead with the test.
Each switch was under lock and key, and Bainbridge was the only man who had a key. The first switch was right under the tower. He opened the box. McKibben and I watched him as he closed the switch. The box was locked.
Not that I distrusted anybody, but I felt more comfortable having those switches locked. And the switches were closed by McKibben at 5:10, and the countdown began.
General Farrell says there was in everyone's mind a measure of doubt. We were reaching to the unknown. We did not know what might come of it.
The sequence of events was all controlled by an automatic timer, except that I had one nice switch, a mechanical switch, which could stop the test at any moment up until the actual firing, at any moment that I could still react, at least, if any of the meters and gauges indicated that there was anything wrong with the test, because, of course, it was terribly important to preserve the bomb for a second attempt if anything should go wrong.
Back at the base camp, about 2 or 3 minutes before the explosion, we all got on the ground, face down, away with our feet towards the explosion, and the orders issued were that nobody should turn to look at the explosion at the countdown until they saw the light.
Another switch was closed by McKibben at 45 seconds before the 0 hour, and at that time, Don Hornig took over the stop switch.
I kept on telling myself that if there's the slightest flicker of the needle, I must throw my switch. My reaction time's about a half a second. I can't take away my attention for even a fraction of a second, and so my eyes were glued and my hands were on the switch. And then I could hear the timer counting 3, 2, 1.
And all of a sudden, an incredible flash of light illuminated everything many, many times brighter than sunlight does in New Mexico at noon on a bright day. Many miles of the desert were completely blinding, and so I actually lost my vision for a few seconds. When it recovered, I turned back, and I saw a huge ball of fire, bright yellow, rising through the atmosphere. And the whole atmosphere in the direction of the bomb was filled with strange violet light.
It was one of the most aesthetically beautiful things I've ever seen. On an enormous scale, this cloud was peach and pink and purple, and just tremendous billows, like a tremendous smoke cloud. And colors would unfold from the interior. I mean, it would darken in places, and then it would open, and a new burst of luminous gas would come to the surface. So I think at that time, I just stood and watched and just completely enraptured.
We knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him, takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
And then the feeling which I think was gnawing at everyone at that time when I shook hands with Oppenheimer, I said, "Now we're all sons of bitches."
After the atomic test, the scientists find the desert at ground zero turned to glass. The Earth lowered 9 feet. General Grove's message to the American leaders meeting at Potsdam with Stalin and Churchill is sent in code.
It was to the effect that the baby had been born, that the doctor, and I think they even said Dr. Groves, was very much pleased, and that he's a very lusty infant, that his cries could be heard, and then they gave the name of Mr. Harrison's country home in Virginia at near Warrenton, and the flash in his eyes can be seen, and then they gave the country place of Mr. Stimson up on Long Island.
It was the news we had been expecting day after day, and it gave us a feeling of confidence to defend ourselves in the future, bring an end to the war desired by all men. We didn't have any celebration, but there isn't any question of the great relief that we had.
At 5:10 on the afternoon of July 16, 1945, at the Sicilienhof Palace, the meeting of the Big Three begins. Stalin says the Russians will enter the war against Japan by August 8. He does not know, is not told about, the new card the president now holds. In public, the Big Three are cordial. In private, friction increases. They bicker over the boundaries of Poland, over Eastern Europe, over Germany. The wartime alliance is breaking up. On the other side of the world, unnoticed in the fury of the fire raids, a single B-29 of the 509th Composite Group makes daily sorties over Japan. Navigator Theodore Van Kirk.
What we would do is assign the crews a target. The bombs that they would carry on these missions were the same size, the same weight, and the same shape as the atomic bomb. They would fly the mission under conditions that were as near as we could foresee them, exactly like the conditions that they would be encountering when they dropped an atomic bomb.
At Potsdam, in the moments before he must approve the final order, the president once again goes over the alternatives with his advisors. Secretary of War Stimson.
In order to end the war in the shortest possible time and to avoid the enormous losses of life which otherwise confronted us, I felt that we must use the emperor as our instrument to command and compel his people to cease fighting, and that to accomplish this we must give him and his controlling advisors a compelling reason to accede to our demands. The bomb seemed to me to furnish a unique instrument for that purpose.
And it was important to bring about an end to the war, and if possible, to do that before Russia came into the war.
It would have come out sooner or later in a congressional hearing, if nowhere else, just when we could have dropped the bomb if we didn't use it. And then, knowing American politics, you know as well as I do that there had been elections fought on the basis that every mother whose son was killed after such and such a date, the blood is on the head of the president.
The question was whether we wanted to save our people and Japanese as well and win the war, or whether we wanted to take a chance on being able to win the war by killing all our young men.
Mr. Truman told me that he had been giving serious thought to the subject for many days. he was just as reluctant as a man could be to decide, and I say for him to decide because it was his decision. Final decision would rest with him. It was an awesome responsibility for him. But he could see no alternative and agreed.
3 B-29s arrive at Tinian from the United States, bringing the last components of the bomb to the 509th. The 509th is now ready for its mission. Now at Potsdam, one final move. John McCloy.
One of the great questions was what we were going to do about the Russians and the bomb, and whether we should notify Mr. Stalin about it. We finally made up our minds that we had to, being partners, but the question was what his attitude would be.
Of course, if you make a communication of this sort to an ally in those sort of circumstances, he will immediately come back and ask for information and require more and more information about it. And this would, of course, created an embarrassing situation because while it would have, it was agreed that the Soviet Union should be told that this weapon existed and give perhaps some indication of its general nature, there was, of course, and could be, I think, no question of giving them any real information.
In view of the fact that neither the President nor I were anxious to have them enter the war after we had learned of this successful test, we were in doubt about what attitude we should take. Finally, at lunch one day, we agreed that the President that afternoon should walk over to Stalin and tell him, in the words that he decided upon, but without going into any details. And that afternoon, at the conclusion of the conference, President Truman walked around to Stalin with Chip Boland, our interpreter, and he told him substantially this, that we want you to know, Generalissimo, that we have now developed what we call a secret weapon, which is of tremendous power, and which in a few days we hope to use in the war against Japan. Well, knowing what he was going to do, I watched intently Mr. Stalin's face.
Pretty much said, well, that's fine, just we'll use it, and what's the next item on the agenda? It let everybody down terribly because we were so worked up emotionally over this thing.
I have always been of the opinion that Stalin did not grasp the importance of the statement.
The Pentagon, the final step to send the 509th on its mission.
The order was issued on the date of July 25th, 1945, was addressed to General Spaatz as commanding the Strategic Air Forces and signed by General Handy, who was acting Chief of Staff. It directed the 509th Group, which was the special group trained for the delivery of the atomic bomb, would deliver its first bomb as soon as weather would permit visual bombing after about August 3rd, 1945, on one of the targets listed, namely Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki. The order stated that additional bombs would be delivered on the above targets as soon as made ready by the project staff, and that further instructions would be issued concerning targets other than those listed.
Potsdam. One day after the bomb order goes out, an ultimatum is delivered to Japan. Despite the urgings of the State Department, it does not specifically tell the Japanese what they can expect if they surrender.
Absolutely futile. There is still time, but little time,
for the Japanese to save themselves from the destruction which threatens them.
July 27, the ultimatum reaches Tokyo. In Japan, 1 million people have died in the fire raids. Food, fuel, clothing are running out. Isolated behind the palace walls, the leaders meet to consider the ultimatum. It does not tell them whether or not they will be allowed to keep their emperor if they do surrender. Once again, the leaders are deeply divided.
My personal opinion was that the Potsdam Declaration did outline the conditions for the unconditional surrender. Since it did offer conditions for peace, we should accept the declaration. The dominant feeling in the army was that the declaration should not be accepted, and that the decisive battle should be fought on the mainland to the bitter end. Unconditional surrender was a term which was very difficult, or rather, utterly impossible for Japan to accept. Wasn't there something, anything better than unconditional surrender?
July 29, the Japanese answer is, we will mokusatsu the ultimatum. Ignore it. Kill it with contempt. August 1. As he leaves the Big Three meeting, the president hears the Japanese answer, interprets it as a rejection, does not recall the bomb order. Thus, the decision which the future will endlessly debate is taken. The atomic bomb will be used against Japan. Tinian, August 5. The bad weather of the past 3 days has cleared. Final preparations for the dropping of the bomb are made.
The bomb had been brought in the day before from its assembly building, put into a pit underneath the plane, jacked up into the bomb bay, and fastened in place in the bomb bay. Bomb bay was closed. The plane was put under guard, awaiting the takeoff the following morning.
The last routine steps are carried out to drop the bomb they call Little Boy on Japan.
There was a briefing in one of the temporary barracks. At that briefing, a number of the people in the Air Force crews learned for the first time something about the bomb they were to carry, its power, its possibilities. It was quite a serious, tense meeting for some of the people there.
Following that, we were told to go get a good night's rest. Now, how they expected to tell you were going to be going out dropping an atomic bomb or a big bomb and then tell you to go get a good night's rest is something that I never figured out yet. I think many of us took sleeping tablets for what good they were, and then we sat up and played poker most of the evening.
At midnight, there is a final weather briefing. Then church.
The church services, this was normal. Everyone was expected and did go to the church services. We had our midnight supper, as it were, and then gathered all our gear together and drove down to the airplane.
We arrived at our plane down on the flight line, I would guess, an hour or so prior to the takeoff time, and it looked to me very much like at least the television version of a Hollywood epic.
There were many dignitaries there, military people. A lot of pictures were taken, a lot of statements were made, and we got aboard our aircraft.
In Tokyo, the divided leaders still argue over how to bring the war to an end. On board the Augusta at sea, the president waits.
And at 2:45, they roll down the runway, center runway of 3. On the 2 other runways were observing airplanes, B-29s, which were to accompany the strike plane. The load was very heavy, the load of the bomb, the fuel was a very heavy load for the plane, and Colonel Tibbetts, the pilot, held the plane on the runway almost to the last 2 feet of the runway, and the last moment he lifted the plane and sailed off, and then started off toward Japan.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds.
Perhaps this report on the decision of the government of the United States to drop an atomic bomb without warning on a city of Japan can best be summarized in the words of the man who, in the final days, lived most closely with that decision, Henry L. Stimson. These are his words written in 1946. The face of war is the face of death. Death is an inevitable part of every order that a wartime leader gives. The decision to use the atomic bomb was a decision that brought death to over 100,000 Japanese. No explanation can change that fact. But this deliberate, premeditated decision was our least abhorrent choice. War in this century has grown increasingly more barbarous, more destructive, more debased in all its aspects. Now, with the release of atomic energy, man's ability to destroy himself is very nearly complete. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended a war. They also made it wholly clear that we must never have another war. There is no other choice.
Hi, I'm Michael Beschloss, NBC News presidential historian. I sure hope you found this documentary on the decision to drop the bomb as interesting as I did. It's very much of a 1965 work, and the upside of that is that Chet Huntley and his NBC News team were able to talk, as you have seen, to so many important witnesses to history who, by the 21st century, sadly, are all long gone. The other side of it is that that was a very different documentary than one we might make in the 2020s. And I thought I'd add this brief coda to say why. Probably we would add 2 questions today that Chet Huntley and company did not ask. Number one, many scholars now believe that there's a considerable possibility that Harry Truman and the people around him, although justified in dropping the bomb, may have been also interested in the possibility that showing the world that we had a nuclear weapon and we alone would be a demonstration to Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union of how suddenly powerful the United States had become, and would be a great addition to us as we made arrangements for the end of World War II, and also, if there was a Cold War, as that hostility unfolded. The second question that was not asked by Chet Huntley and the NBC News team of 1965 was one that we would certainly ask today. And that is, if you look at Harry Truman and his advisors, were they affected by the knowledge that they were talking about dropping an atomic weapon on an Asian city, on a Japanese city, and not a European city? Did race intervene? Is there any possibility that they would have made a different decision if they were making the decision to drop a bomb on a European city? And keep in mind that Truman's recently chosen Secretary of State, James Burns of South Carolina, who appears in the documentary, was one of the most notorious segregationists in the United States, someone who certainly did not feel that Japanese were the equal of Europeans. Did that play a role? All that having been said, what stands out to me is how people of conscience at the time understood that this was not an easy decision. Yes, it might speed up the end of the war and foreclose an invasion of Japan, but did it open a nuclear age that would one day bring the end of the world? No one said this better in this film than J. Robert Oppenheimer. If Oppenheimer came back to life today in the 2020s, he would be shocked by the degree to which nuclear weapons have spread to rogue nations and to terrorists and to others, probably would redouble his efforts to make sure that there was some way the Earth did not end in nuclear fire. Nowadays, the specter remains. Thank you all for watching.